So, Stephen, thanks for coming on today. I'd really love to start with the journey, the musical journey. I think a lot of band fans oftentimes don't start with the band. It might not be the first group that they listen to when they're starting to really kind of get into music, and that's kind of the joy of it a little bit. I find, but it's always a different story for different people, and they come to it at different ways. So. I just would love to start with asking you, what were those first early sparks? What really got you passionate about music that now has led you to a career where you talk about music all the time, you're writing about music, all of that?
Well, I have to first and foremost thank my parents for having great musical taste. Um, Oddly enough, my first concert was a Judas Priest concert that my dad took me to. But the live concert experience kind of, ignited something where I wanted to be a part of that. And two really disparate influences. My mom was like the 60s kind of pop, Beatles, Monkees, oddly enough. And my dad was more like, like I said, the Judas Priest, like Pink Floyd. And through those kind of experiences, I started my own path, and it started with the Beatles and the Stones. And through that, I made my way, and I can't remember specifically how, but as probably a lot of band fans, to The Last Waltz. And that was something, as soon as I saw The Last Waltz, going with that love of concert experiences and what was being instilled in me, it blew my mind, because it was all of these folks and musicians and artists that I'd heard about on one stage. I didn't have a context at that point this was probably 15 years old, but it was something that I just jumped into, which I have a tendency to do. And that's kind of how the Richard book came to be, is I jumped in as deep as I could, went off, just enveloped myself in it. And really, it just kind of went from there. I started just collecting and going to record shows, and it just became a part of my existence. But I owe it early, to my formative love of music, obviously, to my folks, and that's kind of what led me on this path.
No, that's fun. I feel like it always starts with metal or something. I was a metalhead too when I was a kid. You can't necessarily trace it directly to the band, but it always comes back around somehow. And that's great that you had parents that had a deep love and obviously a plethora of different type of music too, because I think that's important to any, I think when we're young too, we get into these like kind of rabbit holes where we're like kind of elitist sometimes about the types of music we like. And then it's like, I only like this type of music. I don't listen to XYZ. But it's really that kind of like, whenever that kind of clicks for people, where it's like, you know what, there's a lot out there. And those kind of rich textures, I think, make the band easier to understand, because I think that's always something too. The Last Waltz is obviously an entry point for a lot of people, but maybe it's the weight, hearing it on the radio or hearing it in a movie or something like that. I've told this story a few times. First time I really heard the band, being a Canadian, they were always there. I didn't like it. I didn't like it. I was like, because I heard the way I heard Lee Vaughn's voice, I was like, this is kind of foreign to me. This is kind of strange. It's kind of country, and I don't like that. And it took me a while to kind of come around to it. But when you watch The Last Waltz for the first time, you also have that visual component too, and you're seeing all this happening. You're seeing all these musicians and everything like that. What hooked you? Was there a member of the band, or was there a song, or was there a particular moment in that film where you were like, wait a second, this isn't just like your average group. This could be something bigger than that.
Completely. And oddly enough, going along with that, my mom listened to Neil Diamond. So I know that the Neil Diamond part of The Last Waltz is often, talked about.
Yeah, sure.
Some people don't, but it's funny because I knew who he was just growing up. So I was like, oh, okay, this guy my mom listens to is in this movie. But obviously the Clapton part, my dad listened to a lot of Clapton, and putting that together, it's like, wow, these guys are really cool. I mean, they're hanging out with Eric. And this is coming from me as, kind of a younger guy. But that's really what kind of grabbed me was, the Robbie and the Eric duel, coming from that age. I was like, wow, this is amazing stuff. And then over time, as probably you know yourself, the personalities kind of show through the film. And, not to jump ahead, but Richard was this mystery, this, enigma to me. I just, it was the kind of things like, I want to know more about this guy. Like, there's like this quiet presence there. And as it left you wanting more because there was such a powerful presence emanating from him. And it's like, well, what about, is there more out of this guy? Like, where can I find out more? And really, that's where early on the journey started, not the book journey, but the journey of like, who is Richard? How does he fall into this amazing group of guys? And you could get that from the film, obviously, that every one of them had this special magic that collaboratively became something bigger than all of them. And that's kind of not to go off on that tangent, but that's where it went or came from.
That's interesting too, because I always think about The Last Waltz, and on the show we've had lots of discussions about it. I charted it over like a 6-episode path to like the whole journey of it. And honestly, at the end of it, and after talking to a lot of people and thinking about it, watching the film a lot of times, The Last Waltz answers a lot of questions, but it also poses a lot of questions that you're just like, I want more. You're looking for more, because it's almost, in some elements, it's like a tease, and it's because it's been contextualized now. The film, 45 years on, it's like we can fill in some of the blanks, but there's still a lot of gaps where in that moment they were just documenting and what was happening. But it's there's so many questions left over. There's so many mysteries, like you were saying, with some of the guys in the band, especially people not named Robbie or Levon, who like definitely dominate the narrative, right? So you've got these other great guys, Garth, Rick, Richard, and you're like, I kind of want to know more, because they have these sound bites too that are like so iconic. Richard's got a few, obviously the break even one, but the marshmallow overcoat, the stuffing, the bologna. Garth's got that whole like awesome diatribe about the priests on, 52nd Street or whatever number in New York. And like, there's these moments and you're like, wait a second, I want to hear more about these. But then you start, I don't know about you, but you start trying to research and you start trying to look these things up. Because I think you mentioned it's like you go full in on these things. I'm the same way. And you start looking, and there's lots of holes. There's lots of gaps. Yes. And for me, that's frustrating because I just want to know everything, So I'm assuming you felt the same way when you started digging into these things, just as a fan, even before deciding to write a book. You're like, why are these gaps? Especially if you compare them to like the Stones or the Beatles or the Dead, where it feels like every moment is documented.
Exactly. And that I can share, that's the frustration that I had is jumping full bore into it, and you're limited. And then the information that was available, as you probably know, there's a kind of a division. If you look, not outside, if you look outside of books and you're looking for information, there's a lot of, and this isn't negative in any way. It's a truth that I learned. There's a lot of ownership and a lot of division when it comes to the band. And I didn't really want to subscribe to any of that, but I wanted to know more. And that's where the struggle with Richard's story comes in. It's like you have this big jumble of information, and there's, like you, to your point, there's holes there. I was like, all right, so how can I fill these holes with Richard's story? Because it called out, and as you have found out, it needs to be talked about, it needs to be explored, but there wasn't much.
Yeah. It's been interesting too, because I've been doing the podcast for 5 years. There was a confluence of things that led to it, and talking to different people and learning more and trying to scrape out parts of the story that hadn't been scraped out before. And there's been, in the last few years, there's been a lot of people that have tried to help. You got generations of band fans turning over. You got people in their 20s, even younger, that are into the band and trying to put their own stamp on it. And I think that's what's really cool about the community. I always love to shout out my friend Bree, because, she had a project that she did for a year called the Richard Manuel Archive, where she did some really beautiful writing about Richard online for a period of time. Because I think her, like us, like so many out there, she's like, there's more out there. We've got the same, and I always try to say this, and sometimes I get in trouble for it, but like there's the same like 6 narratives out there, and it's the same 6 stories, and oftentimes they come from Robbie, because he was asked about the same 6 things over and over again.
Yes.
And and the same with Levon, right? It's like the same 6 stories. It's just like, okay, well, what about these other points? And that was a disappointment in reading the books too, because it's like when you read Robbie's book or you read Levon's book, those same gaps that were there prior to their books are still there after the books came out. And it's like, why? So, okay. So talk to me a little bit about then Richard specifically, because I first got into the band threefold, to just contextualize this, because I feel like we have a lot of similarities. I saw Garth Hudson at a Canterbury Folk Festival, which is in Ingersoll, Ontario. It's where my wife's from. It's a small town, Southern Ontario. He played there with Maud, and I was just like completely taken aback by it. I really had no real clue who Garth Hudson was, other than he was a member of the band. At that exact same time, I was going to school in London, Ontario, and I met a gentleman who was doing a play on Richard. It was a community theater play about Richard and his whole life. And he had talked to Richard's family, people like Al. Al was a character in it and everything like that. So I saw that. My friend Brock played Eric Clapton in the play, actually. And then at the same time, I coincidentally was going to school with Drew Danko, Terry Danko's son. I saw, some of Rick's basses. I was like, this is super cool. And I watched The Last Waltz at the same time. So I got this sign that there was something more here. And like I just started digging in, and I had a grand vision as a young 20-year-old that I was going to make a documentary about Richard. And I tried and met a lot of hurdles, but also I just wasn't skilled enough to do it at that point. So I started the podcast. But Richard was always it for me. I love all these guys. And, having spent time with Garth, he's amazing and I love him. But Richard was always my guy. There was just something about him that I was just obsessed with. The aura, the songwriting, the look, the whole thing. What was it about Richard for you that really got you enticed enough to spend so much time, writing a book about him?
So where it kind of started for me was right around 93 or 94. I had a friend who was really into the band. And again, we'll go back to jumping into something full bore. So I started taking bootlegs and stuff, making these mixtapes for him because he had turned me on to him. I'm like, have you ever heard this? Hey, you got to check this out. And, through these live performances, I just, even these things that were recorded in a pocket in the back of an arena, Richard's voice would just slice through these tapes, and I'm one of these, I got bootleg ears. I'll put earphones on and go deep and listen to these shows and try to put myself there as much as I can. And over the course of time, I just started feeling like a real affinity for him, like you, out of all of the guys. Love all the guys in the band. But so fast forward a little bit, I went to Woodstock to see Garth at the Colony Cafe, Garth and Maud. And at this time, I was fully into them. And I met Garth and talked to him about the Hawks and about Richard. And you've probably heard him say it a couple times. He mentioned the energy piano, and he lit up. And I went there twice and saw them in this really, really small venue. And that's where the seed was kind of planted about, okay, I can do something here. After I graduated, I'm an English major, which essentially means I don't have a degree in a sense. And so when I graduated, I wanted to feel like I was using my abilities in some way. So I started Talk from the Rock Room. Started doing reviews, started doing things. Ultimate Classic Rock asked me to do a piece about Richard because it was an anniversary. So I did that. And I did a piece on Talk from the Rock Room. And I got a random message from somebody that said, you ever think about writing a book? And I was like, I have, so I tried. And to your point, it was a false start. I couldn't get in touch with anybody, couldn't really make any move. So I went another direction, tried to work on another book, had a bunch of like fits and starts, couldn't really go full strength. And then finally, right before the pandemic hit, I was like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to focus on Richard, and I'm going to see what I can come up with. And I wasn't looking to interview people or anything. I was just like I do on a website or you do on your, I was just going to just try to be creative with it and make even an opinion piece, analyze the music. And I started moving forward, and all of a sudden I just was like, this is taking on its own momentum. Like I felt like, okay, there was a series of events that started to happen, and I was connected with John Till. And once I was connected with John Till, and I talk about this in the book, but this is interesting. I was connected with John, and our first conversation, John was like, I don't have the time or the inclination to write a biography on Richard Manuel. And I said, John, I can completely respect that. Thank you so much. And I was like, I don't know if this is going to happen again. I just don't know. And I didn't realize that John was ill, and he just wasn't having a good day. And we talked for hours, and he was beautiful and just an amazing human being. And Dorcas, his wife, just a beautiful human being. And we had this beautiful conversation, and really, and I'm sorry if I'm going off your intended question, but how this started was, I was like, I'm going to do a story about Richard growing up, because there was so much repetition, like we alluded to, of band stuff, the same 6 narratives. It's like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to dig any deeper. I'm just going to focus on Richard and see where it leads. Maybe go to the first band album, maybe to the base. It was just one of these things. You throw the ideas out. Sure. And then through John, it was hard because during the pandemic, I couldn't get into Canada. So I was like, oh, I'm stuck here. I got to do everything remote, And that's really like the end of 19 into 20 is where I really started to kind of try to compile things and my own research, stuff online, libraries, just kind of trying to gather stuff. And then when I finally could get to Stratford, it was just like, yeah, this is how it's supposed to be. Like you could, as silly as it sounds, you could feel it. You could totally feel it. I went to the fairgrounds, where Richard sang Georgia. You could feel it. And his family were so accommodating. I ended up through John meeting Bob Kalmusky, meeting Garth Pico, who was in the Revels, went to his, and then I met, which I didn't know, and he's Richard's childhood best friend, Chuck Kelly. And we spent a lot of time together. And really, to your point, there was a big gap of things that were never known or told or talked about with Richard. And I feel like that's the most important thing that I've learned about this project is his formative years and how they were so vital and so important to understanding the stuff Last Waltz, post Last Waltz, like just knowing who he was, where he came from. It sounds obvious, but those are the things that really, and once that happened, it just started rolling. And I could relate to so many things. Small town, wanting to play music, wanting to escape, like all these things, you could relate to, and that's part of the reason probably why you connected with Richard. You can relate to him at such an important level. And really, like I said, I felt like it just took on its own directive. I just feel like it just kind of, I had this inertia and kept moving forward, and every person I talked to led to another, and they all loved Richard so much that it was easy. Everybody was so willing, everyone was like, had a huge smile when you talked to them about Richard. And that just was, said everything to me. And I'm just thankful. I do have to say, I'm just thankful for all of his family and friends up there in Stratford and here in New York. But they're just amazing people, and they really wanted something to be done for Richard, which is kind of how it happened.
Cool. Yeah, great. I have so many questions here, but I'll start with one. Out of what you said, there's a few things I want to touch on. Um, but I want to go back to narratives, right? Because I think it's important.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think it's very easy to like paint people into corners or put them in a box because it's easy to do. And we do this as humans, right? We're like, it's easier to identify certain things or just simply put things in a certain way. That way it makes sense in our brain. And one of the things that always interested me was that what we know in large part about Richard Manuel as an individual very rarely came directly from his own mouth. Okay. And I find that interesting because it doesn't really give him a chance to say his own piece. And you know what? Maybe he didn't necessarily want to, and that's fine too. But you get this picture of who Richard was from other people, both good and bad. And that's why I hold on so dearly to that interview from what is it, 83, 84, the Ruth Albert Spencer interview where he talks, because it's like, okay, this is Richard sitting down on a long form piece talking about himself and his influences and his music and how he feels about the band. And that was rare. So one of the prevailing things that you hear about a lot is it's the families and the people that knew him were difficult to talk to. They are private individuals. Some have passed too, so that makes it extra challenging. There is kind of a narrative out there that there's an element of shame because Richard, unfortunately, killed himself. And I've heard these things before, and I've heard them repeated before, and I just take it as it is. But I'm like, it's more complex than that. You spent some time with his friends and family, like you mentioned, and it seems the opposite. It seems that they're very warm and inviting and welcoming, and they probably provided a lot of the context that nobody's ever been able to provide before about his formative years, like you mentioned. And what was the most surprising about that process for you, like learning about where he came from, who he was, and like how his family life was, how his upbringing was?
The most surprising thing was, and to me, was how completely enveloped in music he was, like from the get-go, from singing in the choir at church. From that moment on, it was like in his childhood friend Chuck, who I mentioned, told me this. It's like he knew exactly what he wanted to do. There was no question. And again, with the narrative aspect that you mentioned, where it's like Richard's is quiet, shy, the normal things that you hear about him. But I mean, he was a powerhouse. I mean, like everybody at school, John, who I mentioned, like he was the hub of this musical blues. And at that time, I mean, a skinny 16, 17-year-old Canadian kid carrying, Bobby Bland records to school. It's like, you're like, whoa, like you were just drawn to him, which continued obviously throughout his whole life. He just had this magnetic personality that people just wanted to be a part of. But the most surprising thing to me is really, it wasn't like he stumbled into this. It's like once he hit on what he was going to do with his life, he went for it. And there was no question. And he was a very driven individual, which I think was part of his downfall, is the disappointment later on. I mean, because he was such a driven, powerful guy. And, I spoke to Eric Clapton for this book, and we were talking about Richard doing the blues as such a young kid. And he said the same thing. It's like the British blues boom was going on. We're talking, 64. Richard's singing the blues, the late 50s. Like he's getting these singles. He's sitting in his room, dropping the needle, and singing with these records over and over and over and over. And it's like, to have that kind of drive at that age and that kind of vision, I mean, it says a lot. So that was surprising me. I just didn't realize that's how it came to be. I didn't know that background story. And to your point, it's something that really wasn't talked about ever. And that was important to me. The Rebels era stuff is so important. I mean, they were vital, as you probably know. I mean, I'm from New York, you being from Canada. I mean, these guys were like, well, it's a testament. They all ended up in their own bands, at some point. So it's amazing. But that was the most surprising thing I learned about his early years, was his drive and his ability to just interpret music, to be such a good interpreter of music that he didn't own. Incredible stuff.
And I guess it makes sense, right? Because to reach a level of success, you have to be a driven individual, right? Regardless of what anybody says or the aftermath of anything, to get to that point anyway, you have to be driven. You have to be talented. You have to want it. It doesn't, very rarely does something just fall into your lap, right? And, I always recommend people go back and listen to bootlegs and stuff of early Richard, like him belting out Georgia on My Mind and things like that, because it's like the kid had talent, and it was like next to none. And that Ronnie Hawkins in that era of the Hawks there, it really was an all-star band. Sure, they weren't all famous yet, but he handpicked the best of the best, and they're all better than your average musician. They're better than your good musician, your great musician, and he put them together. And on the research phase, and obviously the challenge of COVID now too, when you started really diving into this again, did you find that a challenge too? Because I assume there's something I've run into sometimes is people are willing to chat. People aren't necessarily willing to be put on the record either, because, naturally people are private. They want to hold these things closely. They don't want to feel like they betray the person. Did you find any challenges with that throughout the journey of writing this, like gaining trust, which I think is always an important part of this, but also not getting things out of people, but, we're seeking to fill in the gaps here, and asking somebody, hey, can you help? And I know it could be hard, but can you help do that?
Yeah, the research phase, and I try to be cognizant of the Richard situation, as far as I wanted to be sensitive. It was very important to me, and this, I don't know if this is normal operating procedure for people that are doing research projects like something like this, but I needed, quote unquote, the approval of his family before I did this. I needed to talk to Richard's kids. I needed to talk to Arlie and Jane. I needed to talk to everybody for that trust, because for this project, I wanted to make sure that everything that I put in that book was something that someone told me, and that's something that I could support through someone else. I didn't want to, I didn't want to be salacious in any way. Richard was a rocker. There's stuff that I left on the cutting room floor because it didn't help his story. You know what I mean? There's no sense of belaboring this night, this happened because these people were doing this, as far as like party. If it didn't push the story ahead or help concentrate a focus on Richard's talents and abilities, I didn't want to go there. There's the elephant in the room. We all know what it is. I didn't have to beat it, but I didn't have to keep beating it down. So what I explained to his family and the people I talked to was like, this is what I'm doing. I want the focus to be on Richard's music. I want to know what made him special to you, and what kind of relationship did you have with Richard, and what made you want to speak to me about him? And generally the answer was always, he deserves this. It's been way too long. But so after I gained the trust of those people and was honest, I just said, like, this started out as a Talk from the Rock Room article. Then it became a story about the early years, and then it became a biography, and it just kept expanding. And as more people wanted to contribute and more people trusted me with telling this story, It finally became a book, but that's the thing that, to your point, the trust and making sure that people know that this is for like we said when we started off, for Richard just to get some recognition before these stories disappear forever.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing, with any of these rock biographies, I wanted this to be different from the fact of, as you had alluded to, you got Levon, you got Robbie's book, and they're all special guys in the band. But really, as I said, with Richard being so driven, like he was an impetus for the band, becoming what they became. And it doesn't, as you probably know, that's not talked about. I mean, at all. Having a vocalist like that was singing those songs, in the Hawks, it's like that ascended them to levels, which Levon has mentioned, that's one of the things, but it's like, so important.
Yeah. No, and that's interesting. I want to talk about some of the songwriting and the importance and the significance of Richard in the context of the band. It's something that there's a couple things to unpack there. I think with the band, for some reason, and well, there's reasons partially, but the merits of who's the most important or who's the biggest contributor or who takes the most oxygen in the room always seems to come down to songwriting. Mm-hmm. When in other groups, that's not necessarily even brought up, right? Because there's multiple components to make a good band or make somebody unique. Songwriting is one of them. Like, that's not to shortchange songwriting. It's incredibly important. There's your musical talent with an instrument that sets you apart. Like, look at all the guitar gods we worship. They're vocalists, that transcend, time, from Robert Plant to Bobby Blue Bland, like you've got all these types, Joni Mitchell, you name it, great vocalist. And that always struck me as the weirdest part about this. We talk about these components and there's more. Richard had all of them.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
Quoting by multiple people as one of, if not the best vocalist of the era. Phenomenal songwriter in his own right.
Mm-hmm.
The only guy, well, not the only guy, but one of the first guys that wrote with Bob Dylan when not very many people have, which is always something that's interesting to me. And an incredible musician, piano, organ, drums, lap steel. Like, I played harmonica too. Like, he played all these different things, right? He could play instruments, play horns. He could do the whole thing. But that's not talked about a whole lot. And it's not a competition about who's the best. But to me, it's a competition to prove that Richard had just as much merit as anybody else did.
Yes.
And we talk about that first album that I think is crucial. Without the first album, the band wouldn't hit the way they did. Everybody was obsessed with that album. Roger Waters, Eric Clapton, who we just talked about. Like, all of these people were obsessed with the Beatles. They were obsessed with this album. And Richard's stamp is all over it. Some of the best songwriting, some of the weirdest, coolest progressions are on this album. And that's Richard's stamp on it. What was it like for you to dive into his ability as a musician and as a songwriter? That was the most interesting. We know he wrote these songs and we can feel his stamp on them, but was there anything within the research for the book that you were really kind of surprised by, or you're like, wow, this is a great little nugget?
He never stopped writing music, ever. And that's, again, we go back to this narrative thing. That's something that I'm always hearing is that, and unfortunately, Robbie mentioned it as well. Some people write one song, some people write 100, when trying to explain why Richard stopped. Yeah. And he never stopped. And that was something that I think I knew but then hearing it from other people, there's some Woodstock musicians in the book who, during that period post stage fright, where Richard was not, he was in bad shape and going, when he was hanging out with people outside the band, he was still an actively creative, people were going to his house. He'd be sitting at the piano, check this progression out. And it's like, something turned where I talked about, the rebels being driven and getting out of this. And that's, what we may never know, but something turned confidence wise. It wasn't that he stopped writing music or he stopped creating or stopped wanting to contribute. It's just the confidence level. And that could be due to a multitude of factors, as you know, environmental, chemical, whatever they may be. And that's the thing. I to go off a little bit. Part of the research of the book was to look for some of this stuff to see if it existed. And I've heard some things, Rick told some guys that when they were at Turtle Creek in Bearsville, recording in between Cahoots and Moondog Matinee, Rick told a couple guys, there's Richard songs. There's Richard songs on tapes. They're up there. Got to find them. I never did. we're there's leads, but basically my point is he was actively creating music and just lost the want, and not really the want, or just lost the ability to present it to his group. And I don't know what that is. And I, go talk about it in the book. There's attempts to figure it out, but as you know, you can't really get there. But that's the nugget, is that this guy, the creativity is pouring out of him, even at his lowest points. It was still all just music. It was all just music.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because I recently did an episode on that too, because, like anybody, I'm consuming these texts, whether they're, from Levon or Robbie, or, Barney Hoskins, or you name it, like the numerous books out there. And that's what's in a lot of them. Like Richard kind of stopped, and he wasn't focused, and he was a drug addict, and he just was a deadbeat. And, I'm not quoting directly, but this is what they're essentially saying.
Yeah.
And when I found that treasure trove of stuff that Terry Danko talked about, where, Terry Danko, Marty Grab, Richard, these guys were writing together. This was later. This is post Last Waltz. They were writing together. And, the story of him and Jerry Goffin writing together, like all these, and I'm like, wait a second here. This can't, where's the disconnect here? Because I'd been told that Richard stopped writing, but now I'm actually getting proof too. Like, there are recordings, I play them in the episode, of songs that Richard helped create, and they've got his stamp all over them.
Right.
And I know we'll never fully know, but it's one of the biggest, frankly, piss-offs to me, is that, like, you have this guy that's super talented, also willing to be a collaborator, clearly too. And what I think, Music from Big Pink's my favorite album. I think Richard is key as a songwriter, and that's missing from the later albums. And I'm like, why isn't it there? And I would really like to get to the bottom of it, because there's that one kind of quote that Robbie talks about a lot, is that he's exasperated almost. He's trying to get Richard to write, and Richard won't do it, according to him.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And like, I have no reason not to believe him, but yeah, it's this great question, or great cloud for me. It's like, why did he lose that confidence to present, if that's the case, right? Why did he not feel, was it this, going back to what you said, this driven nature, this confidence thing? It always felt that Richard never felt like he was good enough. And maybe that was why. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, and yeah, going along with that, you think about, we were talking about with the Hawks and him being this killer blues singer, and he silenced his voice when they joined up with Dylan. Like, he willingly went to the background and became, a part of the band, of Dylan's band, and just contributed, was still constantly creative. But I always go back to that. I'm like, he was willing to, because that's one thing, and that I've learned about this, is Richard was loyal to a fault. When he was asked to join the Hawks, he wasn't going. He wasn't going to go. It was like, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to leave my best friend Jimmy Winkler, who was the drummer of the Revels. And that was one thing that was constant throughout his life, is the loyalty aspect of it. So for him to, like, silence his voice, that shows the ability to be flexible and do whatever is needed for the better of the group or the better of everybody, and I mean, you probably know this, Tyrell, when you listen to Cahoots, that there's no Richard melodies on that record. You can feel it. The songs are all written on guitar for the most part, but I mean, you can, with the exception of a couple little pieces where I'm like, oh yeah, that's Richard. Like the music is naked without his contributions, and that doesn't mean that album. I mean, I'm a fan of the record. That's not a knock on the record. It's just that moment where there were no longer Richard Manuel contributions is stark. It's like, wow, and this I'm going to make, this is me just making an assumption. If you have listened to the Watkins Glen performance that they did, coming out, and you listen to the entire show, and there's that instrumental piece, that sounds like a Richard Manuel song to me. And like I said, this is just me, there's no way to know. For a while, I'm like, maybe that's why these didn't come out in an official release, because some of these instrumental pieces, it's based in piano. Rick comes in on this nice sliding bass part. I'm like, this sounds like a Richard song, So that goes to the point of what Rick had told people around Woodstock, that they were woodshedding stuff in this down period for Richard. Again, where are these songs? Why weren't they expanded on? Because you hear this thing where, well, we didn't have songs or nobody was writing. It's like, I don't buy it. 100%. I really don't. And the book tries to answer that question, but again, my personal opinion about this, like I said, I give multiple options in the text. My personal opinion on this is that Richard, something happened along the line where he felt that things weren't being, and this isn't the songwriting credits, it's just things weren't going in a direction where he could feel confident with management, with his bandmates, with the band becoming huge, and he wasn't feeling like he could give this. I don't think he was willing to take the slings and arrows that would come at him, if there was these songs. And Robbie was a powerhouse. I mean, we know this. He was, at that point, he was an absolute powerhouse. And there's going along with that, it's like we'll never know the inner dynamics of that group. These guys loved each other, but I've heard from a number of people, they weren't like hugging each other. You know what I mean? They hung out and did their own things outside of the group. And I just feel like that Richard was the kind of individual that just, as you mentioned with the collaboration stuff, that's where he was at his best. When he had others, he could pitch in. He'd walk around Woodstock and borrow from Bearsville instruments and show up at John Sebastian's house and just play. And it's like, that's where he was at his best. And why the Revels were great, why the Hawks, he was willing to take a step back because it was an all for one attitude. I think once that kind of helped or fell apart, it helped push Richard into a spot where he was just like, you know what? I'm just gonna ride the wave right here, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, because I think that falls in line too, though, with a large part of the prevailing narrative, which I feel like is accurate, which is like, the first two albums, especially the third, seem like a group effort. And I'm not even talking about the songwriting credits, but like the music itself feels like a group effort. It feels like people contributed lyrically, arrangement wise, instrumentally. They're literally sitting in a room looking at each other recording this stuff, and after that, that's when some of the magic is gone. And I think this is not unique to the band, which I think a lot of people need to also realize sometimes. It's like, step out of the tunnel vision and realize that a lot of these things are like tales as old as time. When things become too big, people change. You've got a group of guys who are like 16, 15 years old, and now you're making records and you got a business together essentially, and you're tied to each other, and you got families, you maybe have dependencies, there's the drug element that, they're all partaking in. Like, these things get complicated, and it's not really a surprise why things don't continue to be exactly the same throughout the history of the group, like any group, right? And now, I have a few other things, and you may not know and you may answer them in the book too. There's a few other kind of points that I find very interesting in Richard's life, um, particularly after the last waltz. I find is a particularly interesting period, which I've tried to chart myself. Um, there was grumblings, there was rumors, there's people that have said it before. Uh, you know, I think Richard could have had a great solo career in the late 70s, early 80s. He had all the writings of like a perfect like AOR piano ballad, like Kenny Rogers type, where it's like you got a powerhouse voice, you need some soft rock behind you. You get inklings of that on Islands with songs like Right as Rain, like where you could be like, okay, Richard, you could have been like a top 40 mainstay.
Mhm.
There was a rumor that him and Robbie tried to produce an album of his in 80-ish. I don't know if you found any info about that or if that's false or if it's true, if it's a rumor. But I was always interested in that period too, where it's like Richard was clearly fiercely loyal. There's lots to talk about him kind of waiting for the band to get back together because that was his like true love. But there's also him talking about and exploring being a solo artist. So like during that period, was there anything that you found that was particularly interesting?
Yes. So after and Richard, when he stopped drinking, and returned to Woodstock, he almost died. I have you alluded to the interview that he did with Ruth Albert Spencer. So I was lucky enough to be able to hear the entire cassettes from that, the stuff that was not put into the interview. Richard called himself a peanut. He goes, I was a peanut at that point. Like he was gone. He wasn't in a good place. He came out of it. And then, to your point, he was going back and forth. He did like some work on a Willie Nelson record. He was going back West Coast, East Coast, him and Arlie. When he came back, he got an assistant. Albert Grossman brought a piano over to his apartment from Bearsville, and Richard was actively starting to do a record. 82, 83, time gets kind of fluid when you're talking about this era. But he was actively writing music. He was going to work with Robbie. He wanted to work with Robbie. It was hard for them to connect. This isn't Richard. Richard was actively trying to make this happen. And I can confirm that. On the tape, he says it. And I'll give you a little bit of Richard, and you'll know this is right from Richard. Richard's like, I told Robbie, maybe we can just get a hotel room together and not tell anybody.
Safe.
He planned it. Now, I also heard from some people in Woodstock when he went to Grossman with this idea of maybe working with Robbie, Albert was kind of like a wink, like, sure, Richard. Like, and Richard got a lot of that. You saw it in the last waltz, the hand on his shoulder. Like, oh, okay, sweet, here's poor, that just kind of vibe. And I think that's what he was getting a lot of, was when he tried to be better, it was still like, oh, Richard. Unfortunately, that's just the reality of it. But Richard actively, yes, was trying to record a record to have Robbie produce it, and he was going to work with Eric. That, I think, was a little more solid because Richard went down to New York when Eric was playing guitar on the Roger Waters album. He was touring with that band. Eric was. They went down to New York City to Arlie and him went down to meet with Eric. And 86 is the year. This is the year we're going to do it. Their calendars, the band was doing a tour with CSN in 85. There was all this stuff going on. Eric was doing Behind the Sun, I believe. And it wasn't, see, that's the thing I also learned. Like, they were in the 80s, Eric and Richard were, every time Eric came to town, Richard was there, vice versa. And Eric played Saratoga in 85 and Richard went down there. And Eric's like, you going to sit in with the band tonight? Richard's like, no. Chris Stainton? No, I can't. He's like, no, come on, Eric. It's like, you got Chris Stainton. I can't do it. Typical, but Eric had said 86 was the year. We were actively going to try to do something. So, and that's one of the things that makes this so heartbreaking, I guess, is every time Richard got that inertia and was ready to go and going to do it, just either had to wait because of schedules or someone couldn't do it, or then he just lost the ambition, which the reality. I mean, he really did. It was hard for me. And he was struggling. He was with addiction. And that's a part of it. No matter how much I didn't want to talk about it, it's a reality that he couldn't get it together. And he was trying, though. And, those getaway shows, I mean, as you've heard, he had songs. He had songs. And more than one person had told me during this period, you were talking about maybe like 82, 83 to 45, he was nipping over to Bearsville, and he'd pop in and be like, is anybody in the studio? And they'd be like, no, Richard, go ahead. And he would go in there and he'd play and write songs or work out songs that he had already written. The Goffman King song, Breaking New Ground. I've got the demo of the Bearsville demo I've heard for the book of that. And it was fully formed. The melody, everything was there. I mean, it gives me goosebumps thinking about it. Like, it was there. And you can, like we talked about, you can feel the stuff from Big Pink, from Beautiful Thing, 66 to stuff in Big Pink. You can feel the Katie's Bing Dawn progression. You can feel this stuff coming out. And it's like, oh my God, Richard, you just got to take it to the, it's like, just push it over the edge. And that, I think, is the most wonderful part, but it's also the most heartbreaking part, is he was ready to do something. And I don't know what it would take to get that to that point, Yeah.
That's crazy. The fact that you've heard the Breaking New Ground tape, the demo, that's crazy, because I know, like, a lot of people wanted to see if that even existed.
It exists. And, we can talk. There's some music around that I'm talking with the Manuel estate, and we're going to see what we can do, because there's not a lot, but there is enough. And there again, there's lots of rumors. I'm trying to put out feelers to have people try to, there's been some tapes and there's been some stuff, but I feel like there is more. I don't know. And admittedly, Richard's second wife, Arlie, when they moved back to Woodstock, after Garth's house burned, right in that area, they lost a suitcase on the flight home, and it had manuscripts, tapes, photos, and Arlie's like, we never saw that stuff again. We never saw it again. So it's hard to say, man. I mean, it could be floating around, We don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. I want to just go back for a second about the connection element, and if you're not comfortable talking about it, that's fine. Richard and Robbie, this is one of the biggest frustration points as a fan for me, because I wrote a blog about it a few years ago, exploring their relationship as songwriters together, which I think is one of the great underrated songwriting pairs of the era. Yes. There's a lot of talk of the Glimmer Twins, Keith and Mick, John and Paul, all of these things. And I know there's less of an output, but Richard and Robbie together, I felt, got the best out of each other, whether it was lyrically and melody or vice versa. I think there was a lot of special things in that, whether it's Whispering Pines or even Sleeping, and it's like, you've got these great songs. I know it feels like Robbie really tried to, like, kind of, and I get it, he tried to make it on his own. And there's that interview from maybe last year, Daniel Lanois, he talks about working with Robbie on his first solo album, and Robbie's kind of reluctant to even bring Garth in, because Lanois was like, we should bring Garth in. Like, this album, it's got all these cool, synthesizers and everything. Garth would be perfect, because he's like the king of that kind of stuff. It would work really well. And he kind of leaves it. He's cordial about it, but it almost seems like Robbie's like, no, I don't really like. You don't really want Garth. I don't really want Garth, And I get it. You're trying to do your own thing. You don't want to be tied down. But that it always disappointed me because if somebody like Richard had come to Rob and be like, hey, I want you to like work on this album with me. I feel like it would have been one of the best albums. It would have been amazing, and you don't know what would have come out of it. Yeah, there would be elements of the band, but Robbie liked to experiment too. It's like maybe there would have been something completely crazy or something completely new that would have come out of that kind of thing, right? And that it always disappointed me too because it's just like you guys could have continued to do some really cool stuff together.
The Petty song that Robbie produced, Best of Everything.
Yeah.
That sums it up right there. That's the kind of direction, and you alluded to it as well, that Richard could have gone in. I mean, when he sings on that chorus, it's stunning. I mean, it takes that song and Robbie's production values from here, and even Petty says it himself, to here, to this level that's just beyond anything. Tom, and I can't remember the book off the top of my head, but Petty had said, I gave this song to Robbie, and he puts Richard Manuel's voice on this, and it like he goes, I didn't realize my music could do this. Like it opened up my vision, and like you said, it's like they could have the ability was there, and I don't know. Again, we can't even figure out whether it's schedules. Robbie doing film and Richard going back and forth, like what it was, but like they just maybe like you had said, it was too close. It was too close to the end. They cut the ties with the last waltz, and maybe Robbie felt that it was just too. And I wanted to ask Robbie about this, and unfortunately, my interview request, it was close, but he was sick, and I completely understand that. But that was the thing I wanted to ask Robbie was about the Petty stuff and the soundtrack stuff when you would invite Richard and the guys in. I wanted to find out. It's like, well, you could have easily expanded on that. It seems like a missed opportunity, like you're saying. It really is.
Yeah, no, it's sad that obviously sad about Robbie's recent passing. I always wanted to ask him that too because I won't say who just because I don't know if they would want me to share it or not. But somebody who is particularly close to Robbie that I know. I asked about this like early '80s album, and they said, and again, I can't prove it. That one of the main things was that Robbie didn't want to see his friends disintegrate, and he always felt that around that period he was potentially willing to do it, but with Richard's state, he didn't want to get too drawn back in because I think I can relate, like it probably hurt to a degree, and to kind of put yourself into that position too would probably you might react the same way. You might be like, I don't know, like, can you like, and it's going to sound bad, but like, can you keep it together long enough for us to do this? Because I know you can do it, but I don't know if we can do it together, and I don't know if we'll make it through the other end and everything like that. But that's one of the great tragedies, but it's also part of the story, and I think it's part of there is an element of beauty in the whole thing as well. We could talk about a lot of different things, but I want to focus a little bit, and we can talk more. We can do multiple episodes if you're willing.
Well, I love talking about this as you do. So.
So let's talk about the book itself. We've alluded to the book, but we haven't directly said it. So earlier this week, depending on when you listen to the podcast, so the first week of September here, it was announced Richard Manuel, His Life and Music from the Hawks and Bob Dylan to the Band is available for pre-order. Schiffer Publishing, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And you can pre-order it anywhere right now. People have been talking about the book. People have known about it for the last few years, just little grumblings, but it'll be available in 2025, May 28th. I think the community, I've got so many messages. People are so excited. And it's all the same. It's like, I love Richard. He deserves this, that kind of sentiment. How does it feel for you? Because writing is one thing. It's the challenge. It's a mountain. You're like, I got to write this thing. You clearly had a journey with it. It started, it stopped, the whole thing. Then the publishing. I've never published anything, but I have plenty of friends that have, and it's a journey in and of itself. So how was that journey then? Was it something that you started while writing? Was it something that happened after you'd written your like original manuscript, or you're like, okay, I've got this thing, I'm going to try to sell it now? What was that journey like?
Yeah. All right. So, going back to my website, because what I do is, if there's something that really connects with me, I want to expand on it. So I do like bootleg reviews, I do some concert reviews, and I try to focus on deconstructing the music and, how it relates to me, how it relates to others. So what had happened with the book is I was going to self-publish. I thought, I'm going to put this together. I'm going to self-publish it. If I can't afford it, then I'll do it over a series on my website. That was really, it was like kind of, that's just where I was. And as it started to expand, I did a review on Talk from the Rock Room of an author, Eduardo Genzolini. He did a Cream book and he did a Who book for Schiffer. Two amazing, deep dives, really focused on a specific period with the Cream book, the West Coast shows in 1968. And I reviewed his book. He sent me a copy. And then he goes, are you working on anything? We were kind of going back and forth. I'm like, well, I'm working on this Richard Manuel book. He goes, you should talk to Schiffer. I was like, all right. And it really, honestly, hadn't occurred to me to put a proposal together. So my editor, Jan Niffler, who's in Rochester, New York, not the publisher editor, one that I worked with on the book, she's like, well, let's put a proposal together and see. And Schiffer took it to their acquisition team, and within less than a week, they said, we want to publish this book. And I was blown away. Seriously, I was absolutely blown away that they had that kind of faith in the book. And it started just this. I once that happened where they wanted it, I really started to focus on. This is kind of an aside. I had 90 pictures donated to this book, 90 photos. Landy, Sheely, Gar, Feinstein, stuff, unreleased photos, stuff from Woodstock in 67 when they got there, like photo. And it's because, again, everyone loves Richard. And they just, a couple photographers were like, well, where else are these photos going to go except a book about Richard? So it was so this stuff started coming in once I had a publisher, it gave legitimacy to the book. That's what a publisher will do, and I love the way that if I had it, the Schiffer is really attentive to the way it looks. They do beautiful work, as far as just fonts and using images and layout. I really was like, that was the most important thing to me, was that Richard got the treatment that he deserved as far as the images and the text working together. And they did that. And after Schiffer, I was like, I don't even want to do any other proposals, like, because I had a certain idea of what I was going to do with the book, but they wanted it. And they love my editor at Schiffer loves Richard and was like, oh yeah, we want it to. And that's the thing. Always people pop out. They're like, we've been waiting for this. We've been waiting for this. And it's been very cool. They've been every step of the way. Right now I'm still, and hopefully I can get you on this. I'm still waiting for my review copies.
Sure.
Get ready to go out, the advanced reading copies and things like that. But every step of the way, they have been there. They've been telling me this is what's happening next, because this is I've been writing 25 years, in different websites and blogs and things, but never a full length, so I'm learning as well, and we cut a lot. My editor and I probably cut 20,000 words from this book. And it's I think it's around 325 pages, maybe 350. I can't recall off the top of my head, but we just kept tightening it down with Schiffer's directive and tried to keep it focused. And the cool thing is, which I was wondering about with a publisher, is I've kind of, what makes it different from a normal biography is I use my kind of talk from the rock room format of breaking down show performances, in a historical context. Like Richard, in a biography, Richard did this, but I also want to talk about this performance and the strong parts and whether a recording exists, or whether, in the context of a tour, was this a good night or a bad night, or, what. So it's a little different, where I tried to do kind of a musical analysis as well as a biographical narrative. But I really think that's what Richard needed, because I listened to every single show from the 1966 Dylan and the Hawks tour multiple times for those just little magic moments of Richard. And I mean, and you can even hear him playing like the melody to Dylan's I Want You on some of these, like just quoting different. And, I'm like, wow, this is just shows his playfulness, shows his want to be a part of something that, and you probably know this through Robbie's book, is Richard was the impetus kind of moving forward with Dylan. Everybody was kind of like, I don't know. And, Richard's like, shit, I'm up for something weird, man. let's do this, and so that's, as far as that, the book's arc, I guess, it follows that path of Richard's life, but it also focuses on the creativity and how that informed his decision making and things that he did and people he met and people he loved.
That's cool. No, that's fantastic. Yeah, I'm looking at the publisher's website right now. So this is more for fans out there. Again, obviously we'll include links and everything, because as a community, and there's a lot of you out there that listen to the show, we're gonna get behind the book, and we're gonna pre-order the hell out of this thing and make it super successful. But it says on the website, 400 pages and 90 color and black and white photos. So not only are you going to get some great words from Stephen, like you mentioned, photos, which, I think is always such a great addition to any text. Even, I know Joe Forno's book that came out a few years ago, we talked to Joe. He had pictures in that book too that was like, wow, I've never seen this before. Or my friend Daniel Rohr, we did Once for Brothers. He had got a bunch of photos that had never been seen before of Robbie and his home films for Once for Brothers. It's like, that is the stuff that we die for as fans too. So you guys are going to love that.
And you're right. And again, I just want to the photographers that were kind enough to contribute these images, their art, to this book because of their love for Richard is just, it's so important. And there's going to be some stuff. I said there were pictures that made me shake when I saw them. You know what I mean? So I hope that everybody loves, like, Dylan's people contributed some photos from the 66 tour, which I'll forever be indebted to them doing that. And it's just the marriage of those two things. What's really is important to me is, again, making that full picture of Richard. And you have to have the marriage of both of those things in order to get that,
Cool. Two last things for this chat, and there's plenty more. I already have a list of things that we can talk about next time. Two things. First, you're the guy to dispel this for sure. Having, as you've told me over this last hour, listened to plenty of bootlegs and shows. Richard could always sing. The motherfucker could always sing. Any rumor about him losing his voice or not being good anymore post, 70 whatever, is, in my opinion, 100% false. I've written an article about it where I gave examples too, but I want to give you the floor here, Stephen, as somebody who's listened to a lot of these things. Can you dispel this rumor once and for all, this silly rumor that Richard couldn't sing anymore?
Yes. And I will tell you, band era, and this, you've probably heard this, is the version of In a Station from the 76 tour. I mean, that show, he does three songs from Big Pink. I believe 3 songs randomly was the first show of the tour. And that version of In a Station, I mean, you go to the show, the King Biscuit Flower Hour the next month, and it's rough. It's rough. But also, you're singing every night. doing things that aren't the best for your throat, smoking cigarettes, like that's, and again, that goes for anybody. That goes for Dylan. That goes for anybody during that era. But that show in particular, and then The Getaway, the second show that hasn't been officially released, Hard Times, is the most devastating thing I think that I've ever heard Richard do. And he closes the show with it. He does a solo version of The Wait for the encore, which is odd, but like he ends the set proper, and he's just like, he sings, oh, Hard Times. It's just devastating. And he's like, oh, that's it. Yeah. And I'm like, oh my God, man, like you probably just brought this entire room to their knees. And it's like, that's it. You know, I think the stuff with his voice, yeah, there were some rough nights, but there were rough nights for all those guys. Really. Yeah. I mean, and what they were doing wasn't the best. And I mean, I'll talk about it in the book, but at some point during those late tours, you know, Richard always had something to clear his nasal passages. He was sleeping with a humidifier all the time. He was aware that his voice was rough, but he didn't lose it, you know, by any stretch. And you're right in that. And the thing is I think also in a weird way, his piano playing obviously improved as he got older, but I think he felt that maybe if there was any sort of loss in his vocal prowess, that his piano playing would make up for that. And when you hear those Getaway shows, you can tell. I mean, it was he had reached the perfect balance at that point where that lived in, aged. And, you know, I'll tell you this, this goes way back, but this applies. When they were at the Rockwood Club, Richard they were staying in a trailer across from the Rockwood Club and down in Arkansas. This is late 61, early 62. And Richard would take the keys and go over to the Rockwood and break in the middle of the night. Well, he had the keys, but he'd open up the door and he'd go in there and he would sing until he was raw. And I always think back to that, like he's trying to emulate these blues guys that he loves. I'm like, by the end of his life, he'd reached that point. He had the lived-in voice and he had accomplished it, you know? And so it wasn't that he lost it. It was like a comfortable pair of jeans, you know? He'd worked his way into it, and now he had that voice. And
it's like old shoe leather or like molasses. Like he wanted that graveliness in there because it gives it so much character. It's baked in. That's a funny thing because so many people do that. They want to sing until they get it there, or smoke more cigarettes. It's it's crazy, but it's like it makes sense. These guys, he wanted to sound like Bobby Bland, who's got that grovel. You know what I mean? So it's like they're all trying to get that.
And that's the thing. And Bobby Bland, like you said, a lot is made of the Ray Charles, but Bobby Bland was where Richard was at. I mean, those shows that he played at the Pavilion in Stratford, it's like he's doing Bland tunes, obviously because of Georgia. And, loved Ray, but Bobby was the guy for those revels, really. And you've probably heard Levon say that too. He's like, we just wanted to be Bobby Bland's band. Like that was our goal, to sound like his backing band. It's like, amazing stuff.
And the last question, I think some folks would be remiss if we didn't ask this one, and it's a tough one. It's a very tough one.
All right.
And it changes, at least for me. But if you had to pick a favorite Richard tune right now on, what is this, Saturday, September 7th at 12:11 p.m. ET, what would your favorite Richard song be at the moment?
Sleeping. It means a lot to me, and it's one of the songs that I really connected me with Richard, early on. Was one of those things. It's just, it's got a lot going on. It's completely stands apart, I feel like, from a lot of the songs on Stage Fright, just because of the ethereal kind of, and you get that on In a Station or Whispering Pines, like you talked about earlier. You can tell when it's a Richard song, because it's got like a, it's not that rustic feel. It's almost got this dreamscape feel that just, it's a band song, but it's a Richard song, and Sleeping really, and I feel like a lot of the lyrical content came from his head, even though Robbie probably formulated it into the context of the song. But I mean, it's one of the greatest songs I feel like he ever did. Definitely.
Cool. Well, thank you, Stephen, for coming on. Like we've talked about a few times throughout this, hope to have you on over the next little bit until the book comes out, and after continue to talk about it and promote it. I know everybody in my family, we're excited for this. We're pre-ordering this book. It's coming out May 28th, 2025. We'll include everything in the show notes. And if you follow along on social media, you'll see me talk about it. But I also wanted to give you a second, Stephen, to plug anywhere where people can find you, and check out some of your other great writing too, because it's not just all about Richard Manuel. You are a music lover, and you've written about a ton of great, interesting stuff. So I want to give you the chance to plug.
No, thank you. Yeah, you can find any of the stuff I do at talkfromtherockroom.com. And I did a radio show for a couple years in Rochester, and now I've taken those shows and turned it into a podcast and try to add new content, which was kind of lacking because I was so deep into the book. So I'm still doing that, and I hope to do a series of like Richard centric with some Richard music, obviously, that I found along the way. But you can find anything about the book, anything that I rant about on that. And then obviously Schiffer books, who have been amazing. And then to your point, it's everywhere right now. And again, I can't say it enough. This is just going to be, my only goal is that it's a beautiful tribute to Richard, and everybody gets something from his story. So truly a hero's journey through this book. And I really hope that's my only goal, is just, I just want to break even. Really. That's it. So, but I really appreciate your work, man. And thank you for having me on. Really, I really appreciate it. It's been great to talk, and I'd love to just, we could go on for hours, I'm sure. So hopefully we can.
Yeah. Thanks again, Stephen. We'll talk soon.
All right. Thank you.